Hi. Multi-hats today. Singing and playing and praying is all good. It's wonderful to worship God, isn't it? It's such a wonderful gift of being able to worship Him freely and safely here. A lot of people around the world don't have that privilege. So we should be grateful. And we will be gracious to those who are still in bed because it is school holidays. There are sometimes difficult conversations when it comes to children. Dad sometimes say, ask your mum when they're tricky questions. Sometimes mum says, go and ask your dad. There's a story of a little girl who went to her mum and said, Mummy, where did I come from? Dreading those tricky conversations about the birds and the bees, or telling the truth that storks don't actually bring babies, but they come in another way. The little girl was sent to her father. Daddy, Mummy says I must ask you where I came from. After an elaborate explanation and a bit of help from Google, Dad told her all about it. And when he had finished, he noticed that his daughter had a puzzled look on her face. She was quiet for a while and then she responded, that's funny, she said. My friend Susan says she came from Palmerston North. Be careful what you wish for with those questions. There must have been interesting conversations happening in this Old Testament story today. Some of them might have been in people's heads rather than spoken out loud. But it's interesting that the chapter 22 of Genesis begins with the same command given to Abraham in chapter 12, which is 25 years before and 10 chapters before, obviously. God tells Abraham, if you remember, in Genesis 12:1, to get out of his country. In Genesis 22, he says, go to the region of Moriah. It's hard to put it into English. The Old King James Version gets it right because of the way it works. In the Old King James, God says, get thee out of thy country. Get thee out, you see. And in the Genesis 22:1, get thee into the land. In English, the best you can say is, go you and do it, you know. It's a unique way of saying it here. In fact, it's the only way this phrase is used in the scriptures, these two occasions. Genesis 12, Genesis 22. It's quite unique. It's a command from God, an imperative. He's speaking, he's directing. The first command cuts Abraham off from his past because he has to leave behind things. The second command potentially cuts Abraham off from his future because he's told to sacrifice his son. Whatever you say about Abraham, his first name became Abraham, he listens. He could have been in the military, I guess. In Genesis 12, he goes and he takes his whole family with. I wonder what conversations they had. We're going where? You don't know? Who told you? What? How? When will we get there? Imagine all those kids. Well, he didn't have them, but all the other cousins were there. And then perhaps in Genesis 22, he leaves early in the morning because he doesn't really want to have a conversation with Sarah. He was avoiding the difficult conversation when Sarah says, where are you going, dear? And he would have to answer, I'm going to kill my son. There was nothing to laugh about then. And remember, Isaac's name means laughter. That's the kind of interesting irony behind this whole thing. So off they go with laughter, his son, two unnamed servants, literally young boys or lads, and an unnamed donkey is there as well. Donkeys appear occasionally, don't they, in interesting times. One assumes the donkey's there for Abraham because he's 100 now. And hopefully he was able to ride the donkey for those couple of days. Strangely, he goes and cuts the wood himself for the altar. He doesn't ask the servants to do that. Maybe, perhaps he wanted to hide the details from anybody, or from Isaac, or certainly from Sarah. Maybe it was time to think about this daunting task ahead. You know, the physical chopping and cutting might have been a distraction from the crisis and the pain in his head, or the anger that he felt. Who knows? We're not told what Abraham said in response. There's no record of what he said along the way. Who knows what conversations happened between father and son? If Abraham ever said, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me, it's not recorded in the scriptures. It's a couple of days on this donkey, and on the third day he looks ahead and he sees the destination, and the donkey and the two young lads are told to wait. And this is what he says. It's really interesting. In verse 5. He said to his servants, stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there We will worship and we will come back to you. Now what was that about? We will worship and we will come back to you. Was that faith that Isaac would come back alive? Or was it just that he couldn't say, I'll be back, because it would have sounded really weird? Not because of the actors who says, I'll be back, but because it would still sound odd, I'll be back. Then I'd say, well, what about Isaac, So Isaac has to carry the wood. Abraham says he has fire and a knife. He wouldn't have had fire. He would have had a kind of a flintstone to start the fire. And they just go along, walking. Eventually Isaac breaks the silence. At last a conversation. Isaac spoke up in verse 7 and said to his father Abraham, Father, yes, my son. Abraham replied, the fire and wood are here, Isaac said, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham answered, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. And the two of them went on together. Nothing further is said. It seems unstoppable. In verse 9, when they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. In Judaism, this is a big story. It's called the binding of Isaac. Akedah means binding. It's a key celebration. It's a source of much theological debate in Jewish history. Much has been written about it. Rabbinic poetry, for example, and drama, trying to capture this occasion. I discovered a verse from a 12th century rabbi about it. It was in Hebrew. I did not read it in Hebrew. I read the translation. But it was interesting that it was written in the 12th century about the binding of Isaac, and it's still used today in can't say the word, Sephardic Judaism. Now the Sephardics were literally means Spain. They were Jews of the diaspora that were on the Iberian Peninsula. And when the Muslim invasions came, they fell under Muslim control, and then the Crusades started and the Christians came and took control over them. A lot of confusion over that as you read it, but this is the poem that Rabbi Yehuda writes in the 12th century. Ironically, he's mourning the loss of his son, because during that time his son becomes a Muslim. So it's really intriguing. It's a long poem, and this is the bit that's interesting. When they both approached to do the service, when Yitzhak, Isaac, spoke to his father thus, Father, here are the fire and the wood for the altar. Where, Master, is the lamb required by law? Are you on this day forgetting your religion? It's really interesting. In the poem, it dawns on Isaac, as he's preparing to offer the sacrifice, that something is terribly wrong. He addresses his father as Master, and there's a hidden message in the question, have you forgot your religion? What he really is asking him is, how can you think of preparing to offer me as a sacrifice? Wouldn't that violate what you believe? And that was the debate throughout those centuries after that, after this poem was written. The theological debate about sacrifice, especially of children. Much later, in the 15th century, that debate would continue in that community, in the Sephardic community, when the Christian Crusades came and the Spanish and Portuguese monarchs came, and they had no option but either to turn from their Judaism to Christianity or to escape. And they were scattered, many of them, into parts of northern Africa. Sadly, some decided that they couldn't do that, and they killed their children and themselves. In fact, there's a story of one rabbi who killed some children, and soon after that, the decree was reversed, and he discovered he didn't have to do it after all. I mean, it really is a startling bit of history. But you think of Masada, for example, the last Jewish stand against the Romans. You get the same thing. Rather than bow the knee to a false god, they take their own lives. Modern views of this binding of Isaac carry on. They talk about the intended sacrifice and suggest that it was really a way of teaching and warning to them to say, this shouldn't happen. You should not sacrifice your children. So they take that as a kind of a learning experience in the Jewish community. Because there's quite a lot of child sacrifice in the Bible. We just don't read it very often. It doesn't come up in our lectionary. You don't kind of find the terrible things that they did to children. You can read about them in 2 Kings 16 and 2 Kings 23. In Leviticus, it's outlawed, it's banned. Leviticus 18:21, 21:1-5, Deuteronomy, Micah, all of those books warn them against sacrificing their children or burning their children. And it was always the firstborn that they did, because the firstborn had to be redeemed. And he often paid his price, or she, with their life. And then later on they found a way to pay money instead of giving up their child. In some cultures where child sacrifice happened, for example in Hawaii, I read about this, that if you were wealthy enough, you could take a servant and let the servant die in place of you if you broke some law. So this child sacrifice in cultures is always about control. It's a very threatening thing, isn't it? If you know that that's coming, you kind of behave yourself. Now that's a long way around back to the text, but that's a little bit of the issue here about child sacrifice. In verse 11, we left Abraham with a knife, waiting. Verse 11, the angel of the Lord called out from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham, here I am," he replied. "Do not lay a hand on the boy. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you have feared God, for you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." He looks up, and what does he see? Not a lamb, but a ram. And he takes the ram and sacrifices it. He would have slit the animal's throat, it would have died, and then he would have burnt it as a whole offering to God. In another Jewish poem later on, Yehuda Amichai, it's a good Jewish name, wrote a poem called The Real Hero. And he reworks this whole story, and he takes it away from trust in God, and he says that the real hero is the ram. Which is really significant. The poem relates in modern Judaism to the Six-Day War and then the Lebanon War of 1982. And there's some debate as to when the poem was written, which before or after the Second War. But what the poet was saying is that when those wars happened, the children, they were young boys, had to go and fight. It was the reality. They had 6 days to sort it out. And then in the Lebanon War, it was even more complicated. But when in the Six-Day War, they take back Jerusalem, the Temple Mount, you see, that's the place where this happens. We forget that. That's the place where Abraham offers Isaac, on the same place where the Temple Mount is today. And when the Israelis took it back, the Minister of Defense got up there and he blew the shofar, the ram's horn, as a sign of power. Here's the poem. The real hero of the binding of Isaac was the ram, who didn't know about the collusion between the others. He was volunteered to die instead of Isaac. I want to sing a memorial song about him, about his curly wool and his human eyes, about the horns that were so silent on his living head, and how they made those horns into shofars when he was slaughtered, to sound their battle cries or to blare out their obscene joy. It goes on. The angel went home, Isaac went home, Abraham and God had long gone before, but the real hero of the binding of the son of Isaac was the ram. The hero is the ram from the point of view of the poem. He portrays the face of the ram as a human face, and he says that those are the young children that went to die in that war without really knowing why they had to do it. Does that make sense? So it's an artistic description of it. Very interesting. If you like that kind of history, I suppose, it's quite fascinating. And of course, the long-term Christian story is that the ram points us forward, even though we're looking back now. Because it's happening on Mount Moriah, the sides of the modern Temple Mount, which is the centre of so much controversy today, it points forward to animal sacrifices rather than people. And that's what happens in the temple. They start sacrificing animals, not people at all. The binding of Isaac It's also described in some stories like this, that kind of tell the story like this. God said, "Take your son," and Abraham said, "I have 2 sons." He answered him, "Your only son." He said to him, "Each is the only son of their mother." God said, "The one whom you love." Abraham replied, "Is there limits to a father's love?" God answered, "Isaac." The binding of Isaac points forwards to Jesus, God's son, who was sacrificed on that mountain. The parallels are there. This is Abraham's only son, the son of the promise, his beloved son. God gives Jesus, his only son, his beloved son. Isaac carries the wood for the altar up the mountain. Jesus bears his cross up the mountain of Calvary. Just as Abraham walked up the hill of sacrifice with Isaac, God would accompany Jesus up the hill to his cross. But unlike his baptism, where the voice says, "This is my beloved son," at the cross there's silence. My God, why have you forsaken me?" There's a prayer from Psalm 22, which later on in the psalm turns to a positive thing. It was the silence of the Father who had called him by name and said, "You are my beloved son." It is on the cross that God provides the ultimate sacrifice, his beloved son, because he loves the world of people. Jesus cries out on the cross and God is silent. Paul sums it up like this in Romans 5. "Very rarely will anyone die for a righteous man, though for a good man someone might possibly dare to die. But God demonstrates his own love for us in this: while we were sinners, Christ died for us." God demonstrates his love. It doesn't say Jesus did. It says God demonstrates his love. He gives his son. In addition, the willingness of Abraham to sacrifice his son was seen by the early Christians as a great example of faith. He's listed in Hebrews 11 with all those great people of faith. It says there, "By faith Abraham, when put to the test, offered up Isaac." The book of Hebrews continues to interpret the story from the point of view of the resurrection. He considered the fact that God is able to even to raise someone from the dead, and in a sense he received him back from there. So much easier to read it from this point of view on the other side of the cross. It would have been really difficult to hear this story for the first time and wonder what happens. It must have been very challenging. Think of what was going on in Abraham's head. Think of Abraham when he argues for the people of Sodom and Gomorrah, how verbal he is, how he kind of battles with God. He brings, "Would you save the city if there are so many righteous?" He whittles them down to 10. Abraham wasn't the kind of guy who necessarily kept quiet. But that must have been a terrible time. Abraham's act has been described as obedience which does not hold back even what is most precious when God demands it, and commits to God even that future which he himself has promised. God provided a son for Abraham, also provided the sacrifice for Abraham. God, not Abraham, paid the price of redemption ultimately, not with a ram or a lamb, but the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. There's a lovely wordplay at the end of this passage in verse 14. I've shared a bit of it in the bulletin today. It's about the word Yireh or Jireh. I talk about in the bulletin the song that we used to sing, "Jehovah Jireh, my provider. His grace is sufficient for me. My God will provide all my needs according to his riches and glory," jumping from Genesis 22 all the way to Philippians, and Corinthians. Paul, says that my God will provide all my needs according to his riches and glory. That Jireh word means provide. God provides. The Lord provides. But it can also be translated as, on the mountain of the Lord, he shall be seen. The same word can be translated as see. So it's not just provision, but it's presence. God is seen. It's really interesting. It points to Jesus in the future, who is both the provision for our sins as a sacrifice and the presence of God. Why? Because he's called Emmanuel before he's even born as a baby. God with us. And that's a wonderful promise. Now, some of you might have been hoping this morning that I talked about the Matthew reading rather than this one. It's a tough passage, isn't it? There's some really interesting things to think about. I think it also speaks of the conversations we have, There's some things we neglect to talk about that are important. Maybe walking down the road with our children, or our loved ones, or our parents. I've asked in the notices today, what do we bind to put on the altar? What do we sacrifice? What are we prepared to give up? What does total faith mean for us, like it was for Abraham? How do we measure our love for God sacrificially? And these are extra questions not in the bulletin. Who is the hero in your faith story? Something to think about. God is our provider, and we give thanks to Him that through Jesus we know God, can love Him and serve Him, and that He speaks to us. Maybe not quite in the same way as Abraham, thankfully. Not calling us to that kind of thing, but He certainly calls us to go where He wants us to go. And we praise His name that He provides for us on the way. Amen. Now, the song we began to sing before we go is a wonderful song that captures the hope that we have that God will make a way when there seems to be no way. And I think that's a great reminder. I don't know what you have in your life that's tough, but maybe the hope of the story will help you, and the song will remind you of God's provision and His presence with us.